In this program, John Mcdowell assesses the role that Davidson's notion of the constitutive ideal of rationality plays in his work. Mcdowell considers many of Davidson's arguments and views and invites him to make explicit the importance of the constitutive ideal of rationality. The areas discussed include the difference between the mental and the physical, radical interpretation, theories of truth, subjectivity, and perceptual belief. In considering Davidson's thesis of radical interpretation, the status of the attitude of holding a sentence true is clarified. Davidson emphasizes that it is not that we begin with knowledge of which sentences a speaker holds true and then proceed to interpret. Rather, we begin with assumptions about which sentences a speaker holds true and then proceed to interpret. And we revise those assumptions in the light of the results of interpretation if necessary. A comparison is also made between Davidson's notion of holding true and Quine's notion of prompted assent. For a fuller discussion of this comparison, please refer to the discussions featuring Jim Hopkins and Gabriel Siegel. Mcdowell also praises Davidson's rejection of the Cartesian conception of consciousness in his article entitled The Myth of Subjectivity, but he presses Davidson to accept that there is nevertheless room for some conception of consciousness in epistemology, consistent with the rest of his views. Davidson denies this and says that he cannot understand what such a conception of consciousness could be. In the background of this discussion are criticisms of Davidson's views about perception made by Mcdowell in his book Mind and World, and Davidson offers reasons for resisting these criticisms. This theme is pursued in detail in the interview by Michael Martin. The session concludes with the following questions. Given that there is an ideal of rationality and that it plays a constitutive role in thought and talk, how is it that we come by it? How do we come to have thoughts at all? Davidson only has time to offer a brief sketch of an answer, but a full treatment of this theme appears in the discussion with Michael Dummett. We now join the discussion at the home of Donald Davidson in Berkeley, California. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next discussant, John Mcdowell, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh. He's going to discuss with Professor Davidson the constitutive role of rationality and the role that that plays as a thread that continues throughout his work. John.
Well, I did think that this would be a good path through the work. It would enable me to start with something that I think you're right about, and get in maybe to things where I think you should be saying different things from the things you actually are saying by your own light, so to speak. So to begin with, I mean, where the phrase, the constitutive ideal of rationality, I think officially shows up, is in mental events. And the idea is doing the work, correct me if I'm wrong, of showing us how to hold propositional attitude concepts, propositional attitude vocabulary, apart from concepts or vocabulary that pulls its weight in describing the nomological layout of naturalistically understandable nature or something of that sort. This seems to me to be a fine thing to do. Some of your admirers, I think, would deplore the fact that I start there saying this is a fine thing to do. I'm thinking of Richard Rorty. Richard Rorty thinks that making a big deal over the difference between propositional attitude talk and, say, physics, making a bigger deal over that than over the difference between, say, biology of whole organisms and molecular biology, is going to encourage people to have their minds boggle over the mental in just the sort of way that you and he agree we shouldn't have our minds boggle. So maybe to begin with, could you perhaps comment on that? That strikes me as completely wrong. It doesn't encourage a mind-boggling. It exactly shows us how not to have our minds boggle over the mental, even though the mental is, yes, indeed, you enable us to say, special, conceptually special. The concepts of the mental are special.
Well, I certainly do think that psychological, mental concepts are different, irreducibly different from the concepts that we use to talk about inanimate nature, or at least most of the concepts we use to talk about inanimate nature. Certainly different from the concepts of physics or chemistry, engineering, whatnot. Irreducibly different in the sense that you can't define or eliminate the mental concepts in terms of the physical concepts, I'll briefly call them that. Mm-hmm. And also irreducible in the sense that there aren't any laws that are strict in the sense in which, let's say, the laws of physics are strict, that connect the two regions. Though one thing that you attributed to me, although I see how it could be taken from what I said in mental offense, I would now be more cautious. I wouldn't say there are no laws that govern the psychological, and I wouldn't even say there are no laws that connect the physical and the psychological, mm-hmm. but they are necessarily loose mm-hmm. because of the difference of the sorts of concepts. I don't see why this should make us feel that there's something mysterious about the mental. It's just different, mm-hmm. Which means when we talk about things like people's beliefs and their actions, we often have a different set of interests than we do when we talk about how to build a bridge.